When you consider the options facing the Speaker of the House here, are we going to start shutting down next week, or will he have to entertain a continuing resolution to keep things open? What do you see coming?
This is a continuing nightmare for my constituents. You are right. Just in case people have wanted to forget, in the spring, we were barreling towards a potential government shutdown because then Speaker McCarthy would or wouldn't contend with the issue of the debt ceiling. Then we saw that we were going to get past the end of September without our appropriations bills done, signed into law. We needed a continuing resolution. Will he, won't he? Then again, as we reached a new speaker, had a new speaker elected, will they, won't they shut down the government? Every single time this happens, the tens of thousands of federal employees I represent, as well as contractors and small business owners and nonprofit leaders across Virginia, are trying to make decisions about how they are going to continue their operations. It is absolutely inexcusable that the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader came to a deal to move forward with appropriations, and now we are hearing that the Speaker may or may not move forward with that. The bottom line is we cannot have a partial shutdown, we cannot have a full shutdown, and if this appropriation bill is not done, or funding bill is not done in time, then we need to have a continuing resolution and then finish the funding as soon as possible, because FY25 funding appropriations timeframe is almost upon us.
Yeah. Well, Congresswoman, I'm sure you're just as aware as we are of the difficult position Speaker Johnson is in, knowing what happened to his predecessor, who essentially had to make a binary choice between keeping the government open and keeping the Speaker's gavel. Would it not make this whole thing easier if Democrats said, look, we will do for you what we did not do for Kevin McCarthy, and if it comes down to it, we will protect you if it means funding this government?
Let me be very clear. Kevin McCarthy made that choice. He didn't have to do anything. He made a deal with the far-right flank to become Speaker in the first place. If he had begun his time as Speaker of the House with a commitment to governing and not bringing us to this point of perilous, is it going to be a nightmare or won't, will it or won't it be, then he wouldn't have created a circumstance that would have put him in that position. Speaker Johnson has the opportunity to demonstrate that he wants to do the job of Speaker of the House, that he wants to govern. He doesn't have to force the entirety of the Republican conference to vote for the bill. He only needs to bring it forward. There are plenty of Democrats who will ensure that we do the basic, bare bones job of actually keeping the government funding, paying our border security agents, our border patrol, paying our service members in harm's way, paying our FBI agents who are keeping us safe from threats of terror, paying the TSA agents at the airports, the air traffic controllers, keeping our planes safe, particularly as we continue to have severe weather events. This is the brass tacks of governing, and the Speaker should do his job, bring the bill. Democrats will surely bring votes. And if those who don't want to vote for it don't have to, but he needs to do the responsible thing and just bring the bill for a vote.
There's a lot we're not talking about now because of all of this. We haven't even mentioned border, which is all we were obsessed with ahead of the holidays, the potential for a generational deal on border that would unlock funding for Ukraine and Israel. In the meantime, there are great concerns about what's happening in Israel, expanding into a wider conflict, Congresswoman, from your perch on the Foreign Affairs Committee and with your experience in the CIA. I wonder what you think the next move should be, particularly with what's happening in the Red Sea. Should the U.S. retaliate against Houthi rebels in Yemen who have been attacking shipping now on a daily basis?
As a former intelligence officer and now a member of the Intel Committee, it is very clear that the United States needs to continue to aggressively demonstrate a posture of deterrence, more aggressively than we have shown.
Should we hit them at the source, though, Congresswoman?
What you're getting at is these are Iranian-backed proxies that are continuing to attack U.S. servicemen and U.S. infrastructure and interests. And we have to demonstrate that that is absolutely unacceptable and that we will take action to defend our own service members and certainly the commercial routes that they have been impeding.
But at this point, Congresswoman, is the only effective deterrence offense? Because the defensive deterrence at this point does not seem to be stopping any of this activity.
Certainly, there are a variety of options before the Department of Defense and the Department of State, and I think any and all of them should be on the table in terms of how it is that we make clear to both Iran and the proxies that are doing their bidding that the increase in aggressive behavior towards U.S. interests and U.S. service members is absolutely unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
Well, as this is all happening, we have a Secretary of Defense who is recovering from an extended stay in the hospital. In fact, I believe he is still in the hospital doing his duties from there, with a lot of questions, Congresswoman, about where he went for a couple of days, why he was not in contact with other officials at the Pentagon or at the White House. The Armed Services Committee in your House of Representatives is launching a formal inquiry, and today we learned that the Pentagon's Inspector General is launching a probe. Considering your experience serving the country and the number of active duty and retired military in your district in Virginia, how concerned should we be here about what's going on? And does the Secretary of Defense owe the president and the American people a better explanation?
I think we've seen the Secretary of Defense has owned his mistake, that he absolutely should have very clearly defined for the White House the reason he was undergoing surgery, and then ultimately when, as we now know, there were complications from that surgery, the reality of his hospitalization. He has owned that mistake. It was absolutely wrong of him to keep that information from the White House. And I think that, now we are in the process of, frankly, moving on from here. It should be the administration's policy to have very clear next steps, that in the circumstance that any secretary may be undergoing anesthesia, may be hospitalized or otherwise incapacitated, that there are very clear parameters on what steps are taken to both inform the White House and ensure chain of command, particularly as it relates to the Department of Defense, but certainly across all of our cabinet secretary positions. Those contingencies are important to have in place.
We're hearing increased calls for his resignation, Congresswoman. Should he resign?
No. Absolutely not. He is an incredibly experienced, steady hand with strong military experience. As long as he is healthy enough and able to continue doing the job, his decades worth of experience is extraordinarily important and vital to U.S. national security.
Well, finally, Congresswoman, you may not be resigning from your current job, but you are seeking another one as you run for governor of Virginia. Is that a statement on the state of Virginia, or is that a statement on the House of Representatives and the ability to get work done there?
Certainly, I have loved my time in the House of Representatives, and despite some of the chaos that we continue to see, I have been extraordinarily successful in getting bills to the president's desk, be it the former president or the current president. But my decision to announce my retirement from Congress and to run for governor in Virginia is based predominantly on my love for the great Commonwealth and my desire to continue my service localized in our Commonwealth.